There's a moment, right before everything changes, when nobody in the room has any idea what's coming. Not the man counting exact change at table 6. Not the cook yelling about an order. And not the waitress standing at the register, watching an old man's credit card get declined for the second time. She didn't know his name yet. She didn't know what he used to build, who he used to be, or how many people used to wait outside his office just to shake his hand. All she knew was that he was 70-some years old, leaning on a cane, turning red in the face in front of a half-full diner on a Tuesday morning. So she did something that took her 4 seconds and cost her $11. She told him it was already taken care of. She had no idea that small, quiet decision was about to undo 5 years of her own quiet collapse. She had no idea he would spend the next 6 weeks trying to find out who she was. And she had absolutely no idea that the soup she paid for was the first step toward getting her whole life back. Her name was Diane Walsh, and 2 years before that morning, she would have been the one signing the receipt, not collecting it. For 12 years, Diane ran a small restaurant on Maple Street called Walsh's Table. 42 seats. A chalkboard menu that changed with the seasons. Regulars who knew her by name before they knew the specials. She built it from nothing, with a business loan, a second-hand oven, and a stubbornness her ex-husband used to call her best and worst quality, depending on the week. She was good at it. Not lucky. Good. She showed up at 5 every morning. She remembered which regular liked their eggs over medium and which one was lying about being on a diet, and she ran that place like it mattered, because to her, it did. It wasn't just a restaurant. It was proof that she had built something with her own 2 hands that nobody could take credit for but her. Then, in the span of about 14 months, she watched it come apart. It wasn't one big disaster. People always want there to be one big disaster, because that's easier to tell. The truth is messier. It was a renovation loan she took out at the wrong time. It was a business partner, a friend, actually, someone she trusted with the books, who made decisions behind her back that she didn't discover until the damage was already done. It was a slow season that turned into a slow year. It was pride that kept her from closing 6 months before she had to, because closing felt like admitting she'd been wrong about herself. By the time the bank took the building, Diane wasn't just losing a restaurant. She was losing the only proof she had that she was someone who built things, instead of someone things happened to. She tells people now, when she tells them anything at all, that the worst part wasn't the debt. It was the silence afterward. The calls that stopped coming. The regulars who didn't know what to say to her in the grocery store, so they just didn't say anything. The way her own son, 16 at the time, started flinching whenever the mail came. So she did what a lot of people do when the thing they built collapses. She found the closest job that would take her, and she put on an apron that wasn't hers, in a building that wasn't hers, and she started over from a place lower than where she'd started the first time. Pete's Diner sat on Route 9, just past the gas station, the kind of place that hadn't changed its laminate countertops since the Clinton administration. Diane started their waiting tables 2 years before that rainy Tuesday morning. She was good at this too, because she was good at people, and because some stubborn part of her still refused to let a job be just a job. But there's a particular kind of tired that comes from doing something you used to own. Every order she carried out was a small reminder of every order she used to write herself. Every time a customer snapped their fingers for a refill, something in her chest tightened just slightly, and then she let it go, because that's what the job required. She never talked about Walsh's Table at work. Not because she was ashamed, exactly. Because there wasn't a version of that story that fit into a 90-second conversation between the coffee pot and table 4. People love a comeback story. They don't love the part right before it. Nobody asks you to describe, in detail, what it actually feels like to fail at something you built with your own hands. They want the headline. Restaurant owner bounces back. They don't want the part where you sit in your car in the parking lot of the bank for 20 minutes because you can't make your hands stop shaking long enough to drive home. They don't want the part where you do the math 4 different ways, hoping one of them comes out different, and it never does. Diane had done the math more times than she could count. She knew, almost to the dollar, the exact week things had gone from difficult to unrecoverable. It was the spring her business partner, a man named Russ who'd known her since high school, started quietly skimming from the supplier accounts to cover his own debts. She didn't find out until an auditor, hired in a last-ditch panic, 3 weeks before everything folded, pulled the threads apart and showed her numbers that didn't make sense no matter how she turned them. She never pressed charges. People asked her why, later, and she never had a good answer that fit in one sentence. The honest answer was that pressing charges meant a trial, and a trial meant testifying, and testifying meant standing in a room explaining, out loud, exactly how she'd been fooled by someone she loved like a brother. She didn't have it in her. She just wanted it to be over. What nobody tells you about business failure is that it doesn't just take your money. It takes your trust in your own judgment. For months afterward, Diane found herself second-guessing decisions that had nothing to do with restaurants. What to make her son for dinner, whether to take a different shift, whether the mechanic was overcharging her. If she could be that wrong about Russ, she reasoned, she could be wrong about anything. There's a particular shame reserved for people who fail at something publicly. Millbrook was small enough that everyone knew Walsh's table, and small enough that everyone knew when it closed. For a while, she couldn't go to the pharmacy without somebody offering condolences like she'd buried a relative. In a way, she had. She'd buried a version of herself. The version who believed that hard work and good food and showing up every single day were enough to keep something safe. She kept one thing from those 12 years. A small brass bell that used to sit by the register at Walsh's table, the one customers rang on their way out if the meal had been good. She kept it in a drawer at home, wrapped in a dish towel, and she never told anyone it was there. Not her son, not the few friends who'd stuck around. She wasn't sure why she kept it. Maybe because throwing it away would have meant admitting the whole thing was finished, and some stubborn corner of her wasn't ready to admit that. Not yet. It's a strange thing, failure. It doesn't announce itself as the end. It just quietly takes the things you used to be proud of and turns them into things you'd rather not discuss. Until one day you realize you've gone months without mentioning the work of your own hands to a single living soul. 2 years into the job at Pete's Diner, Diane had built a kind of quiet code for herself, one she never said out loud, because saying it out loud would have made it sound bigger than it was. Treat every single person at every single table like they matter, regardless of what they tip, what they order, or how they talk to you. Not because it's good business, because it's the only thing left she got to decide. It sounds small. It is small. But when you've lost the big things, the building, the bank account, the title on the door, the small things are what you have left to be proud of. Diane couldn't control much about her life anymore. She could control whether the man in booth 3, who came in every day and ordered the same dry wheat toast and never said more than 6 words, left feeling like somebody had noticed him. The job had its own rhythm. In by 5:30, coffee on by 5:40, the regulars rolling in by 6. There was Hal, who ran the hardware store and tipped in exact change. There was a table of retired men on Thursdays who argued about football scores from 40 years ago like the outcome still mattered. There was a young mother who came in some mornings looking like she hadn't slept, and Diane always found a way to bring her food before she asked for it. No charge for the extra side. Nothing said about it either way. And there was the elderly man who started showing up about 8 months back. He came in alone, always in the same gray coat, always asked for a booth near the window, and always ordered the same thing: a cup of soup, dry toast, black coffee. He moved slowly, with a cane that he set against the table with a kind of careful precision, like a man who had learned, the hard way, that falling was a real possibility now and not a hypothetical one. He didn't talk much. He thanked her for the coffee in a voice that sounded like it didn't get much use during the rest of the day. Diane had clocked, the way waitresses learn to clock things without trying, that he never seemed to be waiting for anyone. No calls. No one ever sat across from him. He ate alone and left alone, and there was something in the careful, deliberate way he folded his napkin before he left that told her this was a man used to being orderly in a life that had stopped giving him much order to be in charge of. She didn't know his name for the first 6 months. She just thought of him as the gentleman in the window booth. The way you start to think of regulars by a single defining detail, because the rest of their lives are none of your business. But somewhere around month 7, Diane started noticing something in him that she recognized a little too well. The way he angled his body slightly away from other tables, like he was trying not to take up too much room. The way he said, "No trouble, no trouble," if she was a minute late refilling his coffee, before she'd even apologized. People who've been knocked down hard tend to develop a kind of reflex apology for existing, and Diane had spent 2 years fighting that same reflex in herself. She didn't know his story yet. She just knew, somehow, that he was carrying something heavy and trying not to let it show in front of strangers, and she understood that particular kind of effort better than she understood most things in her life. That Tuesday in March, it was raining sideways, the kind of rain that turns Route 9 into a string of headlights and hazard lights. The diner was half full, mostly truckers and a couple of retirees waiting out the weather. He came in at his usual time, ordered his usual order, and when the check came, he reached for his wallet the way he always did, slow, unhurried, a man who had paid for things his whole life without a second thought. He had no way of knowing that this particular Tuesday was going to be different from every other Tuesday before it. His name was Walter Greer, and there had been a time, not even that long ago, when his name meant something to a lot of people in this state. Walter built a small precision parts company from a rented garage in 1979 into something that, by the time he sold it at 68, employed almost 300 people across 2 counties. He wasn't the kind of businessman who made headlines. He was the kind who showed up at 6 every morning, knew every machinist on the floor by name, and signed the bonus checks himself every December because he wanted people to know exactly who was grateful for their work. He married Eleanor in 1974. 46 years, give or take, of a marriage that worked the way good marriages work. Not without friction, not without the long stretches where 2 people are basically just colleagues raising the same kids, but solid in the way a load-bearing wall is solid. You don't notice it until it's gone, and then you notice it's the thing that was holding up everything else. Eleanor died 3 years before that rainy Tuesday. Cancer, slow, and then suddenly not slow at all. Walter had nursed her through the last 8 months himself, refusing the hospice aids until the final 2 weeks, because some part of him needed to be the one doing it. 6 months after she passed, Walter had the stroke. A mild one, the doctors said, as though there's a version of losing partial control of your own leg that qualifies as mild. He recovered most of his speech within weeks. The leg was a different story. He came out of it with a drag in his left foot and a cane he was told he'd need indefinitely, a word that landed on him harder than the diagnosis itself. Here is the part nobody tells you about getting old and slowing down in a country that runs on speed. People stop looking at you. Not cruelly, just absently, the way you stop noticing a chair that's always been in the corner of the room. Walter noticed it everywhere, in the impatient sigh of the kid behind him in line while he counted out change with stiff fingers, in the way young clerks raised their voices at him like slowness meant deafness, in the calls from his son in Denver that had drifted from weekly to monthly to, "I'll try to get out there for the holidays." He wasn't poor. That's an important detail, because people assumed struggles like his only come paired with struggles like Diane's. Walter had money. He had more money than he knew what to do with, sitting in accounts that mostly just sat there, doing nothing for anyone. What he didn't have was anyone who needed him for anything. He had spent 40 years being needed, by Eleanor, by his employees, by his son when his son was young, and then, almost overnight, by no one at all. His house told the story better than he ever could. Eleanor's garden out back had gone to weeds the first summer after she died, because he couldn't bring himself to either tend it or tear it out, so it just sat there in that particular limbo grief leaves behind. Her reading glasses were still on the nightstand. Her side of the closet was untouched, not out of sentiment exactly, more because moving her things felt like a decision he wasn't ready to make, and he'd discovered that a man living alone can put off almost any decision indefinitely if no one's around to ask him about it. The phone rang for him maybe twice a week. A pharmacy reminder. Occasionally his son. He'd started talking to the television some evenings, not because he'd lost his mind, but because the silence in that house had a weight to it that needed something, anything, pushing back against it. So when his card declined twice in a row at a diner on Route 9, in front of strangers, on a Tuesday that was already gray enough. It wasn't really about the $11. It was about one more small proof that the world had quietly stopped making room for him. The card declined the first time, and Walter didn't think much of it. Banks made mistakes. He pulled a second card from the worn leather wallet Eleanor had given him for his 60th birthday, and he handed it over with the same unhurried calm. It declined again. He felt the heat climb up his neck before he understood why. It wasn't really about the money. There was plenty of money, somewhere, in some account he hadn't checked in weeks, because checking it required remembering passwords his son used to manage for him. It was the sound of it, the small mechanical beep of rejection. The teenager working the register glancing past him at the next person in line, not unkindly, just efficiently, the way you'd glance past a stalled car that wasn't worth waiting for. Walter had spent 4 decades being the man people waited for. Now he was the man holding up the line. "I'm sorry," he said, to no one in particular. Already reaching for a third card he wasn't sure would work either. "I don't understand. Let me." That's when Diane walked over. Not rushed, not making a scene. She'd seen the whole thing from across the room while she refilled coffee at table 4, and she'd made her decision somewhere around the second decline. The way you make decisions you don't examine too closely, because examining them might talk you out of making them. "Mr. Greer," she said. She'd learned his name off his card on the first decline, glancing at it the way cashiers do. "It's already taken care of. Go on and get out of this rain before it gets worse." He looked up at her, and for a second, something passed across his face that she'd remember for a long time afterward, though she couldn't have named it in the moment. It wasn't relief, exactly. It was closer to disbelief. The look of a man who'd braced for embarrassment and gotten dignity instead, and didn't quite know what to do with the difference. "I can't let you do that," he said. "You just did," she said, and smiled, and started clearing the next table like it was nothing. Like it was $11.04 and not worth a second thought. It wasn't pity. That was the thing Walter would turn over in his mind for weeks afterward. The thing that separated this from every other small kindness strangers occasionally extended his way. The held door, the patient smile, while he fumbled with his cane. Pity has a particular shape to it, a softness around the edges that says "I feel sorry for you." What Diane gave him had no softness in it at all. She'd looked at an old man whose card had been declined twice and treated it like a logistics problem, not a tragedy. She solved it and moved on, the same way she'd have solved a missing fork or a cold cup of coffee. He left $11 under his coffee cup the next morning, folded into a precise, careful square, with no note. It wasn't about paying her back. It was the only language he had left for what he was trying to say. Diane didn't think much of it at the time, either, not in the way you'd think. She clocked out that night, drove home in the same rain that hadn't quit since morning, and made dinner for her son without mentioning the old man whose card had declined twice. It wasn't the kind of thing that felt like a story yet. It was just a Tuesday, one more shift in a life made up mostly of shifts. If you'd told her that night that the man in the gray coat was about to hand her life back, she would have laughed, not unkindly, the way anyone laughs at a stranger claiming to know something about their future that they don't know themselves. Walter went back to Pete's diner the next morning, and the morning after that. He told himself it was because the coffee was decent and the booth by the window got good light, but if he was honest with himself, and 3 years of grief had made him uncomfortably honest with himself, whether he liked it or not, he went back because of 4 seconds that had happened the day before. He started noticing things he hadn't noticed in 8 months of being a regular there. The way Diane handled the table of retired men on Thursdays, letting their football arguments run long because she could tell it was the best part of their week. The way she always brought the young mother with the tired eyes a little extra on her plate without ever making it a transaction. The way she remembered, without being told twice, that Hal from the hardware store liked his coffee topped off before he asked. It wasn't performance. Walter had spent 40 years in business rooms full of people performing kindness for an audience, and he knew the difference between a show and the real thing the way you know the difference between a handshake and a grip that's testing you. Diane wasn't performing. She was just built that way, the same way some people are built tall or built stubborn, and it had apparently never once occurred to her that it was remarkable. He found himself thinking about Eleanor, oddly. Eleanor used to say that you could tell everything you needed to know about a person by watching how they treated someone who couldn't do anything for them in return. She'd say it about waitresses, about doctors, about the men who used to work the floor at his company. Walter had built an entire hiring philosophy around that sentence once, decades ago, without fully understanding why it mattered so much to her, until he was the one sitting on the receiving end of it, in a window booth, with a bad leg and a quiet life. He started paying closer attention to the diner itself, too. Not just to Diane, but to the building, the chipped laminate, the handwritten specials board, the framed photo behind the register of a much younger Pete shaking hands with someone at a ribbon cutting decades ago. Walter had spent his whole career around small businesses, knew the math of them in his bones, the way most people know the layout of their own house in the dark. He could look at a place like this and tell, within a few visits, who was running it on instinct and who was running it on fear of what happens if they stop. Diane wasn't running anything here. She was a waitress. But Walter had spent enough mornings watching her work the room, efficient, warm, completely without wasted motion, to recognize something underneath the apron. He'd seen that exact quality in maybe 4 people in his entire career, and 3 of them had ended up running departments for him. He started asking small questions. Not to Diane. He wasn't going to make a project out of a woman who'd shown him a moment of plain decency. He asked Pete. One slow Wednesday afternoon when the diner had emptied out and Pete was doing the books at the counter. She used to run her own place, Pete said, not looking up from the ledger. Few years back. On Maple. Real nice spot, from what I heard. Didn't work out. Walter sat with that for a long moment, turning his coffee cup slowly on its saucer. Didn't work out, he repeated. How? Pete shrugged. The universal shrug of a small-town diner owner who knows more than he's willing to say about a co-worker's private business. You'd have to ask her that. She doesn't really talk about it. Walter didn't ask her. Not yet. But he went home that night, and, for the first time and longer than he cared to admit, he opened his laptop and started looking something up that wasn't an obituary, a medical bill, or an old photo. He typed in 2 words, Walsh's Table. What Walter found wasn't much. A defunct website with a sun-bleached photo of a chalkboard menu. A handful of old reviews, the kind people leave when they actually mean it. Best meatloaf in 3 counties. Diane remembered my anniversary 2 years running. This place feels like someone's kitchen, because it basically is. A short article in the local paper's business section from years back. The kind of puff piece about a rising local entrepreneur that papers run before anyone knows how the story ends. And then, near the bottom of a search result, a single line from a different article, 3 years later, filed under local business closures. Walsh's Table, a Maple Street staple for over a decade, has closed its doors. No further comment was available from the owner. No further comment was available from the owner. Walter read that sentence 4 or 5 times. He knew exactly what a sentence like that was hiding. He'd written versions of it himself, decades ago, back when he'd had to close a satellite plant in a neighboring county, and a reporter had wanted a quote he didn't have it in him to give. Sometimes, no further comment doesn't mean someone is being evasive. It means they've run out of words that don't break something open. He didn't need to know every detail to understand the shape of it. A small business, 12 years, built from nothing, gone in what was probably a single brutal stretch of months. He'd seen that pattern enough times across his career, in suppliers, in competitors, in companies he'd quietly acquired out of bankruptcy for parts, to recognize the signature of it. It rarely happens because someone didn't work hard enough. It happens because the math turned against people who were doing everything right, or because someone they trusted wasn't worth trusting, or both, layered on top of each other until there was no path back. What stayed with Walter wasn't the failure. It was the absence of bitterness in the woman he'd watched for 8 months. He'd known plenty of men in business, successful men, men with much softer landings than whatever Diane had been through, who never recovered the warmth in their voice after losing something that size. They went hard. They went cold. They started treating every new relationship like a transaction that owed them something back. Because the last big thing they'd built had taught them that trust was for people who could afford to lose. Diane hadn't gone cold. She still brought free food to a tired young mother who couldn't ask for it. She still let a table of old men argue about football 15 minutes longer than the table turnover charts would have liked. She still looked an old man whose card had declined twice in the eye and gave him his dignity back without making him ask for it. Walter sat in his quiet kitchen, the laptop glow the only light in the room, and felt something he hadn't felt in 3 years, maybe longer. Not grief. Not the particular grayness that had settled into his days since Eleanor. Something closer to purpose, small and unfamiliar, like a muscle he'd forgotten he had. He'd spent 40 years building a company by finding people who had the thing that couldn't be taught, the instinct, the care, the refusal to do anything halfway, and giving them a real shot at proving it. He'd retired believing that part of his life was over. He was wrong. He just hadn't met the right person yet. Walter spent 2 weeks thinking it through before he said a word to anyone, because he'd learned, the expensive way, that good ideas executed carelessly are worse than no ideas at all. He knew the first thing he had to get right was the framing. If he walked into that diner and offered Diane money, she would say no, and she would be right to say no. He understood her well enough by now, not personally, but the way you understand a type of person you've spent a career around, to know that a woman who'd survived what she survived wasn't looking for someone to rescue her. She'd had enough of being talked about in the past tense, enough condolences disguised as small talk. An offer that smelled like charity would insult the very thing that made her worth investing in. So he didn't think of it as charity. He thought of it the way he'd thought about every real investment he'd ever made in his career, as a bet on a person, with terms, with risk shared honestly on both sides, with the kind of structure that would let her walk into the arrangement as an owner, not a recipient. He found a vacant storefront 2 blocks from where Walsh's table used to be, a space that had sat empty for over a year, the kind of building landlords dropped the rent on out of sheer fatigue. He talked to a lawyer he'd used for 30 years and asked her to draw up something specific. Walter would provide the capital and the building lease. Diane would own 51% of the business outright, structured so that no matter what happened, no matter how the partnership ended, the place would always legally belong to her more than it belonged to him. 51%, his lawyer repeated, the way people repeat numbers that surprise them. Most investors want control. I've had control my whole life, Walter said. I want this one to actually be hers. He spent a long evening writing out, by hand, on a legal pad, exactly what he wanted to say to her, because he knew if he didn't plan the words, his nerves would botch them. He wasn't used to being nervous. He'd negotiated million-dollar contracts without breaking a sweat. But this felt different, heavier, because the stakes weren't measured in dollars. They were measured in whether a woman who'd been burned once by someone she trusted would let herself be burned again by trusting a stranger. He went to the diner on a Thursday, during the slow stretch after the lunch rush, and he asked Diane if she had 10 minutes to sit down. She hesitated, not because she was suspicious of him exactly, but because nobody asks a waitress to sit down unless something is either very good or very bad, and her life had trained her to brace for the second one. He told her, plainly, without dressing it up, what he'd found out, what he'd built once, and what he wanted to do now. He told her about the storefront. He told her about the 51%. He told her, looking her straight in the eye, that this wasn't about the $11, and it wasn't about pity, and if she said no, he'd still come in every Tuesday and order his soup and his dry toast, and nothing between them would change. Diane sat very still for a long moment, the kind of stillness that comes right before someone either cries or laughs, sometimes both. Then she asked him the only question that actually mattered to her. What happens when I get it wrong again? And Walter, who had failed plenty of times himself in 40 years of building things, gave her the only honest answer he had. Then we fix it together. That's the whole difference between a partner and a debt collector. Diane didn't say yes that day. She told Walter she needed time, and he told her to take all of it she needed, because rushed decisions were exactly the kind that had cost him money over the years, and he wasn't about to let her make one of those on his account. She went home that night and did the thing she always did when something big landed in her lap. She got the brass bell out of the drawer, the one from Walsh's table, wrapped in its dish towel, and she set it on the kitchen table and looked at it for a long time. Her son, 17 now, came in for a glass of water and asked what she was doing. Trying to figure out if I'm an idiot for considering this, she said. Considering what? She told him. All of it. The card decline, the $11, the storefront, the 51%. Her son, who'd watched her come home exhausted for 2 years without complaint, who'd seen what the after of failure looked like up close in a way no kid should have to, listened to the whole thing without interrupting once. Mom, he said finally, you've been telling me for 2 years that the worst thing that ever happened to you was trusting the wrong person. Maybe this is just you finding out if you can still trust the right one. She didn't sleep much that night. She kept circling back to the same fear, the one she hadn't said out loud to Walter and probably never would, not directly. It wasn't that the business might fail again. Businesses fail. She'd made peace with that risk a long time ago, the way anyone who's actually built something has to. It was that she might let herself hope again, fully, with both hands, and have it taken from her a second time, and she wasn't sure she had a second collapse left in her. But there was something else circling underneath that fear, quieter, that had been building in her for 8 months without her fully naming it. It was the way Walter had looked at her across that table at the diner. Not like a man buying himself a feel-good story. Like a man who recognized something in her because he used to carry the same thing himself, before life had slowed him down and taken his wife and left him eating soup alone in a window booth. She thought about Russ, too, more than she wanted to. About how trust had felt easy the first time, before it cost her everything. And how a person could spend years afterward mistaking caution for wisdom, when really it was just fear wearing a more respectable coat. She didn't know if Walter was different. She knew she couldn't run the rest of her life only doing business with ghosts, refusing every hand that reached out because one hand, once, had reached out to take instead of give. She called him 3 days later and said yes. Before I tell you what happened after that, because what happened after that is the part that actually matters, the part where you find out whether any of this was real or just a nice moment that fades. I want to say something to you directly. If you've stayed with me this far into a story about a waitress and an old man and $11, you're probably someone who still believes small moments can mean something. That's rare lately. I don't take it for granted. If you've made it this far with me, I want to invite you to subscribe to our channel and join us every day, because this is exactly the kind of thing we tell stories about here. Quiet people doing quiet things that end up rewriting everything. Now, back to Diane, standing in an empty storefront 2 blocks from where her old life used to be, holding a key she wasn't sure she had the right to hold yet. The storefront needed more work than either of them expected, which is true of almost every storefront that sat empty for a year. The wiring was outdated. The kitchen equipment Walter had budgeted for ran $11,000 over because of a permit delay that pushed the contractor into a more expensive season. Diane found herself, more than once, standing in a half-gutted dining room at 8 at night, covered in drywall dust, wondering if she'd just talked herself into repeating the exact same mistake with a different investor. She told Walter that, once, flat out, on a night when the stress had worn her down enough to stop being careful with her words. He didn't argue with her or try to talk her out of the fear. He just nodded, sat down on an overturned bucket in the middle of the construction mess, and said, "Tell me what's actually different this time. Not what you hope is different. What you know is different." So she told him. This time, she had majority ownership written into a contract her own lawyer had reviewed line by line, not a handshake with a friend. This time, she had a partner who showed up to check on the work himself instead of just wiring money and disappearing. This time, she was older and harder to fool, and she'd already survived the worst version of this story once, which meant she recognized the warning signs faster than she had at 35. It wasn't fast. It wasn't easy. There were weeks that summer where Diane worked the dinner shift at Pete's until close, and then drove straight to the new space to paint until midnight, because every dollar she saved on labor was a dollar that made the math less terrifying. Walter showed up more than she expected, too. Not hovering, not directing, just present, sanding shelves with his bad leg propped on a stool. The same hands that used to sign off on million-dollar machine orders now learning how to use a paint roller at 71. Something happened to Walter during those months that he hadn't expected and wouldn't have asked for if you'd offered it to him as a choice. He stopped being a man eating alone in a window booth. The diner crew started waving him over for coffee even on days he wasn't buying anything. Pete's regulars, the Thursday football table, started including him in arguments about games from decades back, and he discovered he remembered more of those scores than he'd given himself credit for. His son in Denver, hearing about the new venture during one of their increasingly rare calls, asked more questions in 20 minutes than he had in the previous 2 years combined. And for the first time since Eleanor died, Walter had something to tell him that wasn't about doctor's appointments. They opened on a Saturday morning in late September, 11 months after a credit card had declined twice in the rain. They called it Eleanor's because Walter asked, quietly, if that would be all right, and Diane said it would be more than all right. It would be exactly right, because some names deserve to keep going even after the person who carried them doesn't anymore. The opening morning wasn't a triumphant scene out of a movie. The espresso machine jammed twice before 10. A regular complained, not unkindly, that the new biscuits weren't quite like the old ones at Walsh's table, and Diane laughed for the first time in weeks and told him to give it 2 weeks before he started filing complaints. But by noon, every table was full, and Diane stood behind a register that was finally, legally, mostly hers, and felt something settle in her chest that she hadn't felt in 5 years. Not relief, exactly. Something steadier than relief. The particular, unglamorous feeling of having built something real, on the other side of having lost something real, and knowing the difference this time. These days, if you walk into Eleanor's on a weekday morning, you'll probably see Walter in the corner booth by the window. Not the investor, not the silent partner on paper, just a regular, same as anyone, working through a cup of soup and dry toast. He could make himself 100 different ways now and still orders exactly the same. Diane runs the floor the way she always did, like every table matters, because to her, they still do. The brass bell from Walsh's table sits by the new register. Nobody told her to put it there. She just did, one morning, without much explanation, and nobody who knows the story has ever asked her to explain it twice. She still doesn't fully know why she paid for his soup that morning. She'll tell you, if you ask, that it wasn't some grand instinct, no flash of premonition that this man would change her life. It was $11.04 and a decision so small, she almost forgot she'd made it by the time her shift ended. That's usually how it works. The moments that end up rewriting everything rarely announce themselves on the way in. Walter doesn't talk about it like a rescue, either. He'll tell you, if you ask him the right way, that he didn't save anyone. He just recognized, for the first time in 3 lonely years, a person worth betting on, and had the means and the moment lined up at the same time, which is rarer than people think. Neither one of them got a clean ending. Diane still loses sleep some nights doing the math on payroll. Walter still has days where the leg aches and the house feels too quiet before he gets himself out the door. Eleanor's isn't some fairy tale that erased 12 years of failure or 3 years of grief. It just gave both of them somewhere to put what was left over, the stubbornness, the discipline, the refusal to quit on something worth building, and that turned out to be enough. I'll leave you with this, and then I'll let you go. Somewhere today, there's a person standing exactly where Diane was standing, quietly doing the right thing for someone who can't do anything for them in return, with absolutely no idea what it's setting in motion. You won't always find out how the story ends. Most of the time, you won't. But sometimes you will. And that should be enough reason to keep doing it anyway. If this story found something in you, stay with us. Follow the channel, and if you know 5 people who'd sit still for a story like this one, send it their way. That's genuinely how we grow. Tell me, honestly, in the comments, would you have paid for that soup? And tell me what story you want to hear next. I read every single one.